Hello everyone, welcome to the first webinar in the New South Wales Small Business Month webinar series hosted by the School of Business. My name is Dr. Michelle Cull and I'm the Associate Dean Engagement in the School of Business at Western Sydney University. Today's presentation will be on economics for small business. I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the various lands on which we meet today and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people participating in this webinar. I pay my respects to elders, past, present and emerging, and recognise and celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal peoples and their ongoing cultures and connections to the lands and waters of Australia. This webinar includes some interactive features such as the Q&A function, which is located on the bottom bar of your screen. Please feel free to ask questions throughout the presentation using this function and they will be answered at the end of the presentation. There is also an upvote option similar to a Facebook like, where you can upvote on a question that you would like the presenter to answer. This simply moves the question to the top of the Q&A. Also, just as a disclaimer, this webinar will be recorded for training purposes. I would now like to introduce you to tonight's presenter, Dr. Edward Mariani Squire. Dr. Edward Mariani Squire is an economics lecturer in the School of Business at Western Sydney University. His research focuses on economic methodology and institutional economics. His work has been published in a range of high-quality peer-reviewed journals. He has provided economic consultancy services and policy advice to external agencies, both governmental and private. He teaches a variety of subjects, including principles of economics, macroeconomic theory, history of economic thought, and political economy. He has a keen interest in Indonesian politics, economics and culture. He also maintains a blog about seminal papers in business. I would now like to hand over to Dr. Edward Mariani Squire to present his webinar topic, Economics for Small Business. Thank you, Ed.
Thanks very much, Michelle, and thanks everyone for coming along this evening. It might be a convenient or an inconvenient time for you, I'm not entirely sure. The topic, obviously, that I'm going to talk about is, as indicated there in the title, it's about the economy, the budget, the recent budget, and small business. What I'm going to talk about really is, for the most part, I'm going to think about things in a big picture way, a macroeconomic way, because I think it's important to understand the overall environment in which any business, including small businesses, exists and seek to function. This is something which is often difficult to understand in the media, and also there's usually not a lot of advice or information for small businesses about the overall economic environment. So let's get started. I'm going to talk about now about the state of the economy and say where we're at. And also I'm going to show you what the government projects for the future, its best estimates for the future, to give you some kind of idea of where at least the government thinks that we're likely to be going over the next few years. So it's key to understanding the economy, the functioning of the economy in the short run, to think in terms of total spending. This is most important. And here economists will normally divide up spending into total consumption spending, investment spending, net export spending, and government spending. If we look at the changes in these types of spending for the whole economy, it's pretty easy to see what's happened. So this is the immediate pre-budget expenditure changes in the economy as a whole. And as you can see there, expenditure, or GDP, that is total production in the economy, has fallen by 7.5%. That is, this is immediately pre-budget. So it's a very substantial fall. This is a significant recession. If we look at the types, the components of expenditure which drive production, we can see government expenditure has gone up a little bit. It's increased slightly. You know, it's less than 1% pre-budget, but nonetheless, it's increased. But net exports, on the other hand, have fallen. Net export spending. Investment spending has fallen. But most important of all, household consumption spending has drastically fallen. We can see here that obviously household consumption expenditure is the key to understanding the overall fall in the economy. It doesn't explain the entire fall in production, but it does explain most of it. If we now think about economic growth, that is the rate at which total production is increasing each year, we can see that the government is estimating that we're going to be in a recession for 2020, 2021. So we will have negative economic growth, but it projects that for next year, the economy will start to grow again. In fact, it will jump a little bit, right? The jump doesn't mean that's not necessarily great news. That increase in economic growth, that 4.75% increase, is because we're in a hole. So we're pulling ourselves out of it. Key to this jump in growth in 2020, 21, 22 is that the government here is assuming that vaccines will be available and that all restrictions will have been removed. You could, however, say that might be an optimistic assumption to make. If we look at the government's projection for economic growth, if we don't assume that, then we have this. That is, we have a much deeper recession now and a slower recovery. You can see that by 2023-24, we've got much higher economic growth, but that's not good news. That just means the economy is growing faster to climb out of the hole, the much larger hole that it's got itself into. If the economy has gone into recession, then we can safely say inflation is not something to worry about. In fact, it kind of is something to worry about because at the moment we're experiencing deflation, very slight deflation. That is a fall in the general level of prices across the economy as a whole. Deflation is never a good thing in a credit-driven economy such as ours. So no one's particularly happy about that. Incidentally, even up to 2024, the inflation rate is really below the Reserve Bank's target range. That is below the inflation rate that the Reserve Bank wants it to be at. This probably means that the Reserve Bank is not going to be increasing interest rates substantially anytime soon, certainly for the next couple of years, unless the inflation rate gets up into and a bit above the target range. Well, what about the human cost of the recession? Best thing to do is look at the unemployment rate for that. And we can see that the unemployment rate for now is estimated to be around about 7.25%, or it will be once the financial year is over, 7.25%. The government is then projecting on slightly optimistic grounds that the economy will recover, assuming we have vaccinations and the removal of restrictions, and the unemployment rate will steadily start to fall. However, we should note that even in 3 years' time, the unemployment rate is not going to be, on the government's optimistic projections, is not going to be at the lower level it was in 2019. So we've got a long way, we've got years to go before we get back to pre-COVID recession in unemployment rates. But if we want a better picture of the human misery generated by a recession, the unemployment rate's probably not the best one to look at. Rather, the underutilization rate is. The underutilization rate means the number of people who are unemployed, completely unemployed, and added to that, the number of people who are underemployed. That is, people who are unemployed part of the time. That is, they'd prefer to be working full-time, for example, but they can only get casual work. And so are unemployed for, say, half the week or 2/3 of the week. If we count those two groups together, then we get a much higher rate. So at the present time, the estimate will be that the underutilization rate will be about 19% of the workforce being underemployed or unemployed. Of course, it's projected optimistically that that will start to decline and eventually we'll start to get back to the underutilization rate we saw before COVID-19 restrictions were in place. Then we can think about the labour market participation rate. Because unemployment rate's important, but unemployment means people who are actively seeking work. They are participants in the labour force. But if we look at the labour market participation rate, we can see this crash that's occurred in 2020. Labour market participation has fallen to 63.5% of the total working age population. That is, in the space of a year, 700,000 people have simply left the labour market altogether. That is, they're not even seeking work now. That is, they've, in a sense, for some reason or other, given up the attempt to look for work. They think it's unlikely they'll be able to find anything, so they don't actively seek work and therefore are not classified as unemployed. The impact of the growth in unemployment and the growth in the underemployment rate means that wage growth is going to be very modest. Now, this is nominal wage growth, that is money wage growth. If we factor in the effect of inflation to think about the real wage growth, that is how much you can buy with your pay packet, then the real wage growth is projected to be virtually zero. That is, no change, no increase in people's standards of living at all for at least the next 3 to 4 years. But we need to bear in mind that it varies from industry to industry. It's not a uniform change in wages. So this is nominal or money wages for just the June quarter of this year. And you can see from that different industries are affected differently with respect to wage changes. So in construction, professional and technical industries, wholesale trade, accommodation, food, real estate, rental, you can see in these cases that you actually have falls in wages, but in the other industries, you get an increase in wages, a modest increase in wages for the month of June, or for the June quarter, I should say. But bear in mind, for the June quarter, if we looked at all industries, you can see there the overall change overall is zero. That is, the positives in some industries are cancelled out by the falls in wages in other industries. You might say, well, this is pretty terrible news, and there's been some debate in some quarters about, well, what was the cause of this problem in the first place? Well, the cause is not COVID-19 per se. The cause is the government's policy response to that. That is to engage in social distancing, the shutting down of certain industries for periods of time, the closing of borders, both state and national borders. And this has caused the collapse, so to speak, of the economy and the rise in unemployment. So one might say, was it all worth it, really? Well, I think the answer to that is partly an ethical question. It's an ethical choice. But if we try to think of it objectively, even if we do say, well, it's a value judgment at the end of the day, let's make a comparison between Australia and a country we sometimes like to compare ourselves to, Sweden. Both Australia and Sweden have roughly the same fall in GDP, the same fall in gross domestic product or production. But in Australia's case, we had severe a shutdown, in a sense, of sectors of the economy, whereas Sweden did not. And the consequence is that Australia has far, far fewer cases per million of COVID-19 than Sweden. The very different consequences for infections and ultimately for death rates. So you can really choose which would you prefer. Do you want 7.5% fall in growth in Australia or 7.5% fall in growth in Sweden? One has far fewer deaths than the other. Or you could say, let's compare two very large economies, Germany and the United States. Germany had severe restrictions in place. The United States, reasonably lax restrictions encouraged by their current president. So you get very different infection rates between the two countries, even though their growth rates or their fall in their growth rates are roughly the same. Or New Zealand and Singapore. Now that's obviously not because Singapore was lax in social distancing and so on. It's simply because Singapore is a country about the size of Parramatta. So it's a very condensed population, and so infection spreads more easily. But their economic growth rates or falls in economic growth are the same. It's a question of, I think it's largely a question of how many infections are you willing to live with? So ultimately it is an ethical question. I think most people would agree that it's not a great outcome for Australia in terms of growth, but it's better than the alternative. Let's think about how the government has responded to the recession due to the restrictions put in place. First, we can look at monetary policy. We can quickly, very quickly whip through that, because the way in which monetary policy is meant to operate is that it, by reducing interest rates, reducing the cost of borrowing, this should encourage investment spending. Cheaper to borrow money for investment purposes, people borrow more, they build more factories and office buildings and buy more plant and equipment and so on. The problem is this. There's the official cash rate for the Reserve Bank. That's the interest rate at which it gets private banks to borrow and lend to each other overnight. This influences the interest rates for mortgages and mortgage home loans and for investment loans and so on. Here's new capital, private capital spending in Australia since 2011. Okay. Here's our problem. Once the interest rate gets below 2%, then investment spending seems to be unresponsive to further falls in interest rates. That is, we can cut interest rates a bit further, but they're so low now that cutting interest rates a little bit more has virtually no impact on investment spending. This means that monetary policy, for the meantime, has effectively been neutralized as a tool by which the economy can be stimulated. And that's why the government has to rely on fiscal policy or the budget. In the budget, the government has referred to what it calls its economic recovery plan. This is the most immediate impact of the budget. The budget papers talk a lot about the medium term as well, but the medium term is really years away, so we're not so concerned about that. The main objective of the economic recovery plan, which is the changes that the government has chosen to make to spending and taxation, is to stimulate consumption and investment spending. Remember, at the very beginning, I showed you that huge fall in consumption spending. The government obviously knows this and is concerned to try and stimulate consumption spending and investment spending. That is to, in its own terms, to kickstart the private economy. The big ticket items of the $110 billion that it's decided to spend on top of what it normally would be spending are these. There's the $75 billion for what it calls its Job Maker Plan. And the Job Maker Plan is it's a lot of different things shoved into one basket. It includes infrastructure spending, it includes wage subsidies, and it includes tax cuts as well. There's the $25 billion JobKeeper program, which it already had in existence. So it's adding on top of the amount that it was already spending on JobKeeper. It's added in this budget an additional $25 billion for that, plus income support for low-income households, especially the elderly. $5.7 billion for additional health support, understandably, and $4.2 billion for additional industry support. But for the current budget, where is it spending its money? So you can see, where is it getting its money from? As you can see here, obviously, individual income tax is by far the largest source of the government's revenue. But obviously, due to the current recession, that individual income tax revenue has fallen compared to what it would have been if there hadn't been a recession. Because obviously, if you get an increase in unemployment, people have become unemployed. They're not collecting income, so they're not paying income tax. So the projected fall in income tax is likely to be substantial, but also sales tax. Sales tax basically here boils down to the GST, and that has also fallen relative to what the government thought it was going to be due to the recession. Why is that? Because of the fall in consumption spending. If households stop spending money on consumer goods, then the amount of money collected in tax is going to be, sales tax is going to fall as well. So these were unanticipated falls in revenue. So the overall revenue ends up being, for this budget, ends up being $463.8 billion. Where's it spending the money this year? Well, this is by function, and I think this is pretty, it's almost all of it is self-explanatory. Everyone knows what health, education, defence, social security and welfare are. They're all self-explanatory. Obviously, social security and welfare is the largest slice of the pie. It is always the largest slice of the pie. But we've also got other purposes. Sometimes people will see this pie and they say, well, what's the other purposes? What's that secret thing? Other purposes here mostly is made up of assistance to the states and territories. The other is other economic affairs. What's that? Well, other economic affairs is where they've put JobKeeper, for example. So JobKeeper and some of JobMaker goes into other economic affairs. So here's what's happening with revenue. We can see there that tax revenue has fallen slightly compared to the previous year, and it's projected to fall again the year after before it starts to rise. This is unusual. Normally, tax revenue, total tax revenue, will normally go up every year a little bit, in line with the growth of the economy. But because the economy has fallen into a bit of a hole, the tax revenue has correspondingly fallen. But equally important, of course, is the expenditure. So expenditure for 2020-21 has skyrocketed due to a lot of the big ticket items on top of what it would normally spend every year. Right? Well, normally when the government collects tax revenue and spends, it normally, except for, very occasionally, it normally runs a budget deficit. So that's kind of built in, it's baked in, this budget deficit. It's called a structural deficit. But on top of that, it's decided to spend more than it ever intended to spend. And so we get this huge spike in spending of $677 billion for this year. And it's projected, it's hoping to get that to fall. Obviously, it's going to fall again because it's anticipating that a lot of the assistance programs are not going to be necessary next year. And then it'll start to rise again. Again, that's normal. It's normal for government spending to rise every year. Okay? That's par for the course. It rises with the growth in the economy. But it does mean that we've got a budget deficit. So we've got a budget deficit for 2019-20. For 2020-21, we have a huge budget deficit, over $200 billion deficit. And then it's projected that that deficit will continue to fall in the years to come. But certainly the government's promise or plan that it was going to be the government that would be putting us into surplus, that's completely gone out the window now. We're now going to be living in the red for the foreseeable future. Well, certainly until the next election comes. So the government has stated that it does plan in the, in the distant future, like in 10 years' time, to maybe get back to a budget surplus. But whether the government that makes that promise now is going to be around in 10 years' time is a whole other question. It's important not just to look at the total amount of money, that is that, $213 billion deficit, but also how big is that relative to the size of our economy? $213 billion is a lot of money if you're in Fiji, but it's nothing if you're in the United States. So in the case of Australia, it's about 11% of our gross domestic product. How does that compare internationally? Australia is #1 in the world for its stimulus package. It has spent more relative to the size of its economy than pretty much any other economy, any other advanced industrialized economy, that is. So it's hoped that that's not an accident. The government has chosen to do this. And it's chosen to do it on the basis that it's trying to minimize the size of the recession. This, I think, is probably a lesson learned from the global financial crisis, when the government engaged in significant expenditure, a significant stimulus package, in order to curtail what would have been a recession. In that case, the government avoided a recession altogether. In this case, the government isn't avoiding the recession, but it's hoping that it's going to ameliorate that recession substantially, more than other countries. So it will be in a better and stronger position coming out of the current recession. But of course, how do you fund a budget deficit? Well, you have to borrow. So the government borrows money. There's two ways in which the government borrows money. It issues government bonds, which could be purchased by the general public, but also importantly, that can be purchased by the Reserve Bank of Australia. Or in other words, government bonds that are purchased by the government itself. The government buys the government bonds from itself. It borrows money from itself. So the government really here has, you could think of it as the government has an infinite line of credit. It can borrow any amount it likes because it owns a money-making machine. So it can borrow money from the Reserve Bank. This is what we colloquially call printing money. It's obviously not literally printing money. They can borrow it from the Reserve Bank to cover that budget deficit. But as we can see, the net public debt is very large and is growing, so that it's, by government projections, by 2023-24, the net public debt is going to be getting close to $1 trillion. And that, close to $1 trillion, is about 44% of the size of the of GDP, of the value of production produced each year. Now, most people, when they see that, have little conniptions about that's almost $1 trillion is insane, and that's totally unacceptable, and we need to do something about that immediately, if not sooner. However, if you're thinking about it like a business, then actually it's not that big a deal. Because if you're thinking about a debt in business terms, what you're first and foremost concerned about is, what are the repayments that I have to make? How much will it cost to service this debt? So we can see here that the amount that it costs to service the debt kind of jumps around a bit, but it's in the ballpark of about $13 billion a year. You can say, well, that seems a lot of money to repay per year. That's just to service the debt. That's not paying it off. It's just servicing the debt. About $13 billion a year. Yes and no. If you compare that to the size of the economy as a whole, it's minuscule. It's less than 1% of the total income generated by the economy as a whole. So if you were to say if you think of yourself as the economy as a whole, you're earning a certain amount of money and you've taken out a loan and you have to pay 1% of your income to service that loan. Would you say that you're in trouble? No, it's nothing serious. There's nothing really to write home about here. I'm not trying to be polemical or controversial or anything. It's simply a boring fact that Australia doesn't have any serious public debt problem. It's a good political football, but at the end of the day, there's no really serious issue to write home about here. Were these necessary measures? The budget deficit and the public debt that it incurs. The government believes that if the budget deficit were not introduced in 2020-21, then production was projected to fall by 6% rather than 1.5%. So the influence of the budget is to significantly reduce the impact of the recession or the depth of the recession, which was the plan all along. And equally, that if the government hadn't implemented its stimulus package and therefore its budget deficit, the unemployment rate was projected to be 12% rather than 7.25%, which is more likely now. This is due to these numbers are coming from modelling, or mathematical models, which are produced by Treasury and the Reserve Bank, by the boffins in Treasury and the Reserve Bank, and they take these numbers to the government and say, well, if you're willing to live with 12% inflation in an upcoming election, sure, no worries, go for it. At which point the government says we should probably do something about that. And we need to introduce a stimulus package, which is exactly what they've done. All right, so with respect to small business measures, there's bits and pieces in the budget that are directed at small business. And I'll just describe these. I won't really provide commentary in any serious way on them. I'll just provide these, and maybe at the end you might have some questions. And Michelle Cull, who introduced me, who is in the area of accounting, might be able to comment on some of them, depending on what your questions are. Because some of these budget measures really are kind of accounting type issues in a way. I should say just beforehand that it's obviously important that small business be provided with some kind of support, because small businesses provide roundabout in the mid-40s, sometimes the high 40s% of total employment in the economy as a whole. So it's not quite half of total employment, but it's getting close to half of total employment. So it's very important that small businesses be provided with support to survive, because without that support, the unemployment rate massively increases. So here are the items in the budget that are particularly relevant to small business. One is temporary, what they call temporary full expensing. So this is where you can have the full expensing of depreciable assets for businesses with a turnover of less than if you've got a business which has less than $5 billion turnover, that might be you, I'm not sure, then you can claim the full expenses on those assets. So this is assets which depreciate over time. So that's buildings and plant and equipment and tools and so on and so forth. There's no limit on the value of the assets, and it's for assets purchased on or after the 6th of October and first used or installed by the 30th of June 2020. So you've got this 2-year window in which you can essentially claim for the depreciation, full claims on the depreciation of assets. The aim of this particular program is to bring forward investment spending. So this is trying to target that investment spending fall and trying to reverse that in some way for small businesses, but also for large businesses, obviously, as well. This is a criticism that's been made of this, is that this is basically a particular policy that was designed for the mining industry. Some critics have suggested that that's the case. But nonetheless, everyone can take advantage of it. There's the temporary loss carryback. So this is where you can apply for tax losses. You can apply tax losses that are incurred during 2019, 2020, 21, and 21, 22 to offset the tax that have been paid in 2018, 2019, or the later income years. This is available for when lodging your tax returns for 2020, 21 and 21, 22. And the aim of this is to boost cash flow so that businesses can stay up and running effectively. So you can basically afford to keep paying the bills, essentially, including your wages, rent, interest payments, and so on. And it's hoped that this will retain workers. And the government says that this might also encourage investment. I think that's probably a little bit optimistic, but nonetheless, it's essentially attempting to keep businesses which might be struggling with cash flow from going under. And allied to that is insolvency reform. So there's been an increase in the threshold from $2,000 to $20,000 at which creditors can issue a statutory demand on a company. There shouldn't be the word "from" there. So, and also it gives businesses more time to respond to a statutory demand, from instead of 21 days to 6 months. So you get a fair bit of breathing room for businesses which are facing statutory demands for payments of debts. Directors are not personally liable for trading while insolvent. This is a temporary measure, obviously, but it is a measure that's been put in place so that businesses, even if they're insolvent, the business, in a sense, can keep running as long as it can, and the director won't be personally liable for the debts incurred. I think that that's right. Maybe Michelle wants to comment a bit on that later. This is available to incorporated businesses with liabilities of less than $1 million. So it's really targeted at small to medium-sized, well, really small businesses. And its aim is to keep distressed businesses afloat. Then we've got responsible lending obligations. So the government has suspended the responsible lending obligations on banks and building societies and credit unions that give small business loans. Essentially, it means that it's much easier for lenders to provide credit to give loans to businesses so that they can stay open and keep their staff employed. So sometimes businesses will, just to stay open, will take out a small loan to cover their costs temporarily. Normally that's something that a bank or a building society or credit union would knock back. In this case, because it would violate regulations, those regulations have been relaxed. And then we've got JobMaker hiring credit. So this is for employers. They will receive $200 per week for hiring an employee, a new employee, aged between 16 and 29, or a smaller amount, $100 per week, if they hire an eligible employee between 30 and 35. Here, a new employee, not the existing ones that you already have. This is available for up to 12 months after the commencement of employment. And its aim is, I think, it's not stated in the budget papers, but I think its aim is to combat youth unemployment. Why target 16 to 29-year-olds? Here's the unemployment rate. Here's the unemployment rate for 15 to 24-year-olds. Remember what the unemployment rate for, and that's up to July 2020. The overall unemployment rate for the economy as a whole, remember, is around about 7.25%. But if you're between 15 and 24, the unemployment rate is over 16%. Meanwhile, the underutilization rate, remember for the economy as a whole, is around about 18%. For 15 to 24-year-olds, it's 36%. So they're extremely high percentages for this particular age group. So it's likely that the government has implemented this particular plan for small businesses especially to try and get small businesses to employ younger people, because there are so many who are unemployed and looking for work. And then we have the apprenticeship support scheme. So this is a 50% wage subsidy for new apprentices and trainees, it's up to $7,000 per quarter. And this is for all commencements or new apprentices and trainees from the 5th of October to the 25th of October this year. And it's available up until the 30th of September 2021. Almost at the end. The Coronavirus Small to Medium-Sized Enterprise Guarantee Scheme. This is guaranteeing 50% of eligible new loans issued by participating lenders to small to medium-sized enterprises. That is, banks, building societies and credit unions will be, 50% of the loan will be guaranteed by the government or by the Reserve Bank, which means that from the perspective of the private lender, is a much less risky proposition. So this is aimed to support unsecured working capital loans to help businesses manage disrupted cash flows for loans which otherwise the private banks would regard as simply too risky. Contentious issues, maybe I'll skip over this. Maybe I'll skip over it. If you want me to talk about that, I'll talk about that. But thank you very much for listening. If you have any questions, I'll hand it over to Michelle now.
Thank you, Ed, for your informative presentation about the budget and how it affects the economy and small businesses. We will now commence our Q&A session. So please direct your questions towards the bottom of the screen in that bar that's at the bottom there in the Q&A section. And Dr. Mariani Squire will respond to your questions as they appear. And he will read your question aloud first before providing a response. So hopefully we have some questions out there. Thank you, Ed.
No worries. Okay, there's a question here from Si-Yun. Michelle might want to help out with these sometimes as well. If I try to find an unpaid intern in a small business, will the business owner get the apprenticeship support fund? I'll give my answer and then Michelle can give an expert answer on this particular question. My answer is no. An intern is not an apprentice. Maybe they're a trainee. You'd have to be employed as a trainee. Okay, that's my answer. Michelle, you want to comment on that?
Yes, I would agree with your answer there. And it needs to be an approved apprenticeship for the support fund to be eligible. But we have to have a look at the detail of the legislation to see if traineeships are also included in that. But internships would not be. And also if this is an unpaid internship, for example, it might be an unpaid internship as part of a for credit university. And so that would mean that the business would not be eligible to any payment. I hope that answers your question. If you have anything further you want to ask, please pop that into the Q&A box.
I should also comment just as a general point about, no problem, Si-Yun. I would just as a general comment about the current budget. we should always bear in mind that the current budget is not what's necessarily actually going to happen. The current budget is a proposal by the government. It is not currently law. So lots and lots of things that are in the budget will be debated within the Parliament and then the Senate. Some of it will be chucked out maybe, some of it will be renegotiated, some of it will be modified, some of it will be kept. Some of it due to higgling and haggling, but also some of it will simply become irrelevant or more relevant based on what happens with the economy as a whole, okay? The government is saying we're going to spend X amount of money on additional healthcare, for example, or additional aged care, but it's presuming a future in which that would be relevant. If it turns out that it's unnecessary, then it won't spend that money on additional health and aged care. If, on the other hand, the coronavirus gets completely out of control again, then it will spend even more than what it says in the budget at the moment. Okay? This is really just a plan. It's not set in stone as yet. Okay? And that's why in the budget papers, you'll always see, there'll always be this table which says something about, which talks about a realignment. That is, basically it's saying, okay, so here's where we were completely off, and now about our tax revenue expectations and our revenue expectations, here's what they are now. Okay, because what was said in the budget turned out to be wrong. Okay. What are those contentious issues? Very interested. He. Thanks, Yolanda. All right, so let's go back to this is a contentious issue. Okay, so this is not me talking. This is me channeling a critic of the budget. There have been lots of critics of the budget. You can go and read up what the ALP has to say, for example, what the Greens have to say, for example, what GetUp, what blah, blah, blah. There's lots of different organisations or entities out there which have very negative things to say about the budget. Very often those things are often about ethical choices. They're ethical questions. For example, one of the contentious issues, which is question, is do we want to have a more unequal society in the future or not? And some people will say, yeah, that's no problem. Other people will say, no, that's a moral travesty and we should avoid it. And very often that'll be a debate about tax. Okay, the current tax cuts, personal income tax cuts, which are going to be introduced through this budget. But I'll talk about not so much an ethical concern, but really what's more of a, roughly speaking, a factual issue. The government has said that tax cuts are estimated to create an additional 50,000 jobs by the end of 2021-22. That, I think, everyone agrees is a bold claim, that it will generate 50,000 jobs. From an economist's perspective, you never think about it just in those terms, because you think about, yeah, it could create 50,000 jobs, maybe. But if you spent the money differently, how many jobs would have been created instead? That's a different way of thinking of it. So a criticism that could be made of the budget is over not just that this is a bold claim, 50,000 jobs. It is a bold claim. It's hard to substantiate that. It's very hard to find out where this 50,000 jobs number came from. Incidentally, you should always be suspicious of projections which are perfectly round numbers like that. That's obviously plucked out of the air a little bit. The problem is that the main beneficiaries in the medium term, the main beneficiaries of the tax cuts are going to be high income earners. Now, you can have a debate about whether that's morally right or not, right? That's an issue of equality or inequality. But leave that aside. Because the main beneficiaries are likely to be high income earners, those households which are high income earners are unlikely to increase domestic consumption spending very substantially. High income earners who receive tax cuts usually do one of two things with that additional money that they receive. They either put it into the stock market, buy some additional shares and let it grow over time as a little nest egg for their kids, or they will spend it on luxury goods that are usually imports. So they'll buy, you know, expensive cars or expensive jewelry, or they'll go on holidays or something like that. But the point is that they don't generally spend it on Australian produced goods to the same extent that if you gave the tax cut to very low income earners, they would spend it on. Low income taxpayers spend most of their income. If they get a tax cut, they spend most of it. High income households tend not to spend most of it. So to give a tax cut to the high income group is not going to stimulate the economy that much in terms of consumption spending, which is exactly what's required now as per graph number 1 that we saw at the very beginning. So, and also it's just a general rule, it's just a basic general law of macroeconomics that tax cuts have smaller immediate impacts than increased government spending in the short term. If the government spends, say, I don't know, spends $100 million on building roads, bridges and schools, that will stimulate the economy more than if it gave everyone a tax cut of $100 million. Okay? And that's just for boring mathematical reasons that will be the case. Okay? It's not as if they will have the same effect. More expenditure versus the same amount of money in a tax cut have different stimulation effects on the economy as a whole. And government spending has a greater effect. Okay. Then you can get into debates about, well, should the government be spending that money on new green technology or new environmentally friendly industries for the future or something like that? That's another kind of debate, which I won't get into that.
We have another question there, Ed,
yep.
From
Yifi?
Yes, and there's also one from John Lewis, if you'd like to address those.
Okay, Yifi, hello, sir. Hello. Under the current circumstances, do international students still have a chance to find a job? Currently, I think that's going to be difficult. Okay.
Although, Ed, we could argue if the international student is under 35, it could be likely that there could be some new jobs created where international students would have an opportunity to secure work. But those positions are also limited to payments up to around $10,000 a year. So they would only be casual work. With all the infrastructure spending, it may create jobs, but that's going to take some time before that trickles down.
And if you're an international student, you would only want a part-time job because you should be studying. So the government has provided some support. It'll be a question of, and we'll have to wait and see what happens. It'll be a question of the extent to which small business, especially, whether they take advantage of these particular kinds of programs, especially, say, for example, the program that Michelle just mentioned now. We'll have to wait and see to what extent there's an uptake of that. I know I did a little straw poll in the suburb I lived in and asked a number of small businesses whether they would take advantage of that, and they said no, they would prefer not to. And I asked them, well, why don't you want to employ any more people? I mean, the government's giving you some money to employ more people. Why wouldn't you do it? And their response was, what am I going to get them to do? Right? I've hardly anyone coming into the restaurant now. I employ another person to do what? Sweep the floor for the 10th time? So for some small businesses, they might not be taking it up at all. Maybe others will. We'll have to wait and see, I think. One would hope, but I'm not a super optimistic person, so I don't. So that's all I can say about that, Yifi. John Lewis, what do you think about calls for raising the GST? Do you think this will help or hurt Australia's recovery? To increase the GST right now would not help Australia's recovery at all. It would definitely not do that. We know that that's the case because for two reasons. Well, two reasons. One, increasing any tax is going to be have a dampening effect on the economy. It will, in the case of the GST, so income tax, if you raised income tax in the middle of a recession, you're going to decrease people's disposable income. They're going to be able to spend less. In the case of the GST, and increasing the GST effectively is contributing to the increase in the prices of goods and services. And it may contribute to households deciding to spend less than they would have otherwise spent. It's likely to have much less of an effect than any change in income tax, but it would have some small effect, and it wouldn't be a positive one. It may help contribute to the government collecting a little bit more revenue, maybe, but I think it would have a fairly minor effect in the current circumstances. It certainly wouldn't help. It wouldn't help at this particular point in time. Also, the GST is to a large extent is a regressive tax. That is, it hits lower income earners harder than higher income earners. Okay, raising the GST hurts the poorest most. That is, the people who are forced to buy, to spend all of their income on food, shelter, and clothing, essentially. Anyway, that's my answer to that question.
Well, thank you very much, Edward. I think we might have to start to wrap it up now. We've just hit 7 o'clock. And I'd like to thank everybody for attending this small business webinar. And we've got some more webinars coming up, another 3 in fact. I might just ask Ed just to move, thank you very much. So you can see the next webinar is actually this week, and that's being presented by Dr. Louise Ingersoll. And the registration link will appear in the chat box below in a moment. There will also be a webinar on digital marketing and another on financial foundations on the dates that are shown on the screen there. And we hope you can join us for those. If you found the webinar helpful and you're considering some other maybe more formal business study, you might want to consider some of our postgraduate studies with our Sydney Graduate School of Management. We offer a Master of Business Administration with 10 diverse specialisations to choose from, and that includes finance, management, marketing, supply chain management, and innovation and entrepreneurship. We also offer other courses in accounting, finance, financial planning, and marketing. If you just want some business basics, you might be interested in our Graduate Certificate in Business. Work experience counts towards admission for this program, which you can also tailor to your needs. If you're interested in finding out more about any of these courses, we do have a business postgraduate session being held on Thursday, the 12th of November, and registrations are now open for that. Should you wish to reach the team at Western Sydney University, you can email us at business.engagements@westernsydney.edu.au, and these details can also be found in the chat screen. Once again, thank you very much for joining us this evening. We hope you enjoyed the webinar, which has now come to an end. Thank you and good night.